Great. Well, thank you very much, Dave. Appreciate the introduction. And yes, hopefully Gary will be able to make it. Um, but anyways, we'll carry on. Um, so Dave asked Gary and I to take a look at the socioeconomics of ecosystem-based management. Um, the reason being that um, the Healthy Landscapes program and numerous other researchers I've done a lot of work and a lot of research looking at the ecological aspects of EBM and how they've been implemented and what the impacts of their implementation have been. But EBM is, um, despite its name, it also has social, economic, and cultural components as well. So it's the full suite of aspects of sustainability or components of sustainability. And those have been less looked at. And so Dave asked us to take a look at those in this project. EBM, as I suspect you all know, I can't actually see who all is on the line here, and I'm guessing that maybe a number of you were in Edmonton last year, and we might have met then, hopefully. But this is a Western Canada focused project and presentation. And if you're in Western Canada, you would know that EBM has become by far the dominant forest management paradigm in that part of the country. And as I mentioned, the emphasis has been on incorporating the ecological component into forest management. There's been much less attention paid to the other components of EBM. And also, maybe partly because its name only discusses part of what it's all about, there's no single agreed upon definition as to what it is. Dave Endison and the Healthy Landscapes Project have done a number of workshops and exercises trying to zero in on more of a definition of it, and it's proven to be somewhat elusive. So the objectives of this project were to, first of all, look at what the transition was like from the previous management approach, which we've called sustained yield management. So how did that transition take place? When? What were the drivers? And what have the impacts of that transition been? Then we were asked to take a look at the current status of the social, cultural, and economic impacts and components of EBM as they're being implemented in the Western Boreal Forests of Canada, and then to take a look at some of the opportunities for bringing those into a next generation of EBM implementation. So sustained yield management has been around for a long, long time, even well before the 1960s. It harkens back to the German and Austrian foresters who their objective was to create a normal forest and provide a sustained yield of timber over an extended period of time. And their emphasis was on the production, and really they paid very little attention to what the forest looked like as long as it could provide the desired flow of timber. And the concept was expanded in the 1950s and 1960s. There were people who were looking at the sustained yield of moose and game and other species with a defined economic value. That was really the focus of sustained yield management. But in the 1960s in particular, and into the 1990s, there was a growing recognition that there were many more values and many more things that forest resource managers needed to be concerned about other than just timber and game. And one of the seminal papers that came out, or reports that came out, was the report by the Brundtland Commission in 1986 called Our Common Future, and it coined the term sustainable development, which was a real game changer for people because it posited that economic development was not actually in opposition to ecological conservation. They were both mutually dependent. You couldn't have one rather than the other. And companies in every sector spent tens of millions of dollars trying to figure out what sustainable development means and how do we implement that? Because hitherto, economic objectives have always been seen as being in opposition to ecological ones, and a lot of that actually still continues. So there was that in the 1990s, 1992, there was the Rio Summit, which yielded the Convention on Biological Diversity. That led to the Montreal process, which came up with a series of indicators for the sustainability of forests, or SFM. In 1993, FSC was developed, and they had, as you know, a series of principles, criteria, and indicators. And that framework was used all around the world to develop a series of criteria, indicators, and principles for sustainable forest management. In the 2000s, the CBFA was an attempt to implement EBM across the boreal forest. So by the 1990s, ecosystem-based management was the new paradigm for forest management, and it has just become more entrenched over time. The transition was brought about by changes in regulations that recognized that biodiversity was important, and that also, like, there was a move from concentrating on species at risk to of course, fine filter approach, which looked at landscapes and all a variety of different characteristics of landscapes, and those were incorporated into the management of the forest and incorporated into forest management plan goals and objectives. Also, forest certification requirements required, or certainly a company had a much better chance of being certified if they were practicing EBM. So what that meant for most of the boreal forest in Western Canada was a change from a 2-pass harvesting system, or even in some cases a 3-pass harvesting system, to an approach that mimicked natural disturbances. Also, what disappeared with the 2-pass and the 3-pass harvesting systems was a fairly strict limits on the size of clear cuts, which were anywhere from, I think, 60 to 100 hectares or so in various provinces were the upper limits. And so there was a realization that disturbances in the boreal can be very large, and there's a wide range of different sizes and different shapes and configurations. And so forest management began to incorporate those into how it was done. And EBM was helpful in terms of responding to natural disturbances, and such as the mountain pine beetle epidemic, for example. So we conducted an online survey, and we had 8 complete responses. And we also last year in Edmonton interviewed between 15 and 20 people. And some of the questions that we asked were about the transition from sustained yield management to EBM. And so there was a good amount of consistency in the impact, in some of the impacts. For example, there was agreement, there was a reduction in the amount of road construction and maintained. And this is kind of obvious because with a 2-pass system or 3-pass, you have to keep the roads open for an extended length of time so that you can go back and get the second pass. It had varied impacts on silvicultural and harvesting costs. With EBM, there was a shift towards more natural regeneration, which has lower costs. The harvesting costs could also be somewhat reduced by having larger harvest blocks, but also there were other just the planning and the layout was a little bit more difficult or more complex, and so some people told us that those costs increased, and other people said that they decreased. There was pretty good consensus that forest planning costs increased considerably, and the main reason for that was that with EBM, there were many more values and many more factors that had to be considered. in planning, and also just with the increasing complexity of forest management, much more complex inventories, forest management models, move to spatial from non-spatial, all of that increases costs. So I think it was difficult for respondents to actually separate the increase in forest management costs between the shift to EBM and just the other changes that were taking place in management, but that was the general feeling. People felt that the transition has helped the main FMA holders or large license holders integrate their operations with quota holders. It's also improved the coordination between companies on the edges of their forest management units in a number of cases. There was a very strong agreement that their EBM should be doing more partnering with and supporting Indigenous communities, but there were only 2 respondents that pointed to the existence of actual partnerships. So this is an area that we'll come back to as an opportunity for further work and for further advancement. Also, the practice of EBM is heavily impacted by other uses of the landscape as well, and the energy sector, the mining sector to some extent, all have significant impacts on the landscape. And so ideally, the forest sector would be able to work much better and much more in a much more coordinated manner with these other sectors. But I guess progress has been very hit and miss in that in terms of doing that. So the other insights that we found was that there was some consistency in some of the directions in terms of the changes in costs or the changes in practices. But there was also quite a bit of variation in the responses, especially around costs. And that's understandable because a number of the people that were surveyed or interviewed weren't around in the 1990s, and so they really didn't know what the costs were at that time. Also, of course, there's been a lot of inflation since then. So it's kind of difficult to take a cost from 30 years ago and translate it, compare it with present day costs. And also it depends a lot on what goes into your cost base. So the cost estimates were kind of hit and miss, but there were some general trends that were revealed. So one of the other things that people said was that they really appreciated or were glad that they have shifted to EBM because they feel it gives them a much better social license. Part of that is the requirements, enhanced requirements for consultation with stakeholders, with Indigenous communities, more interaction with the government as well. And they feel this is very helpful in terms of improving the image of the company. And as I mentioned, there are a number of partnership gaps that we've identified. There's better working relationships generally with the quota holders, but there's again a lot of other opportunities to work with other types of partners. So EBM is implemented. So there are 5 key principles that we've kind of put together that underpin EBM, and these are linked to the 12 principles in the Convention on Biological Diversity. And these were devised in a way to ensure that there's a coherence or a logical chain of causality between global and national and local efforts. So what we have here are the 5 key principles of EBM and the linkages to the principles of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And I'll just read them here. The first is to prioritize ecosystem health and sustainability. The second, integrating ecological, social, and economic goals. Third is embracing adaptive management practices. Fourth is involving stakeholders and Indigenous people and encouraging collaborative governance. And the fifth is to incorporate a mix of traditional and scientific knowledge. And the two principles that are highlighted are the ones, or in bold, they're the ones that have seen the most work put into them, and the other three are somewhat lagging in relative terms, in terms of the effort and the amount of progress that's been made with them. So, what we feel is that the integration of ecological, social, and economic goals remains um, a critical. It still remains like a critical gap or opportunity for further work, and we see it involving industry, First Nations, government, and NGOs as well. Um, so there's the degree of integration and collaborations with First Nations and with Métis communities as well is quite variable across Western Canada. It depends a lot on like the provincial government framework that's been put in place and the amount of I guess the amount of commitment that the provincial government has shown to reconciliation. But in particular, First Nations both have rights. They have people who want to work in the forest sector. More and more, they've got a lot of investment capital or have access to investment capital. Plus, they have a huge social license. So, in many respects, they make for very good partners with industry and with government. And their views on how forests should be managed are often a little bit less industrial and a little bit less intensive than what the current industry and current government standards are, but they're not opposed to forestry by any means. And so um, there's um, there's a lot of opportunity for expanding partnerships with Indigenous peoples. And we feel that, again, there's a role here for government and NGOs to participate in this as well. And this is happening in other countries in particular. I believe it's World Wildlife Fund and Conservation International are doing a lot of work in Brazil with Indigenous communities and with companies there to jointly manage forests and co-manage areas that include very intensively managed plantations, but also a lot of natural forest as well. So, you know, there's many places in the world that are working hard on this, and there's a lot of other examples or examples outside of Canada that we can look to examine and gain from. One of the other aspects too is that in this is that in uh, the actual part of the land base that's readily available for forest management is actually a small fraction of the total land base. And this is really clear in Alberta, where you have the contributing and the non-contributing land base. And so the non-contributing land base is obviously not managed for timber, but it does produce a lot of, it produces a whole range of other values and is kind of in management limbo in many ways. And so um, it's it seems like it's a real opportunity for a partnership to take a closer look at how the non-contributing land base can be managed in a way to enhance the other values and the other benefits that it creates. And also, the last element here is the integration of traditional knowledge with contemporary scientific research needs encouragement here. And again, this is something where if you've spent time with Indigenous people and been out in the woods with them, you will see that they look at things quite differently and they have a very different feel for things. And in many cases, there's I think a complementary between their knowledge system and Western science as opposed to them being in opposition. And one of the areas where I think this is maybe particularly true is with respect to herbicides. So as I think most of you know, um, most Indigenous people are strongly against the use of herbicides, or certainly much lower level of usage of them. And um, with climate change and with um, more sort of more pressure being put on maintaining biodiversity, it seems to me that there are very good reasons to consider moving away much harder from the use of herbicides that we have right now. So that's just one example of where I think traditional knowledge and contemporary knowledge could work hand in hand to produce a better overall result. So the next generation of EBM, we feel, um, would have a much stronger social, cultural, and economic component to it. And one of the areas where uh, we think a good starting point would be to start gathering data on the impacts, the level of activity associated with these three aspects of sustainability. It's useful for reporting, for one thing. Um, as again, I'm sure you all know that there's, despite what may happen in the short term with politics, there's still a drive, a longer term trend in favor of more transparency and more sort of public demonstrations that companies and organizations are managing on a sustainable basis that includes the social, cultural, and economic components of it. And so being able to provide proof through data um, that your company is doing that or your organization is doing that is something that's going to be required more and more. I think also partnerships are even more essential going forward, because one company or one organization can't do everything. They don't have the mandate to do everything. Um, they also need the buy-in of the other users of the land base in order to do something. And it's through working together that um, are more the most appropriate balanced types of solutions or approaches can be developed. Um, NGOs, um, Indigenous communities, other types of organizations, um, they all have things that they can offer that will help a partnership. And um, so it just seems like this is one of the opportunities, again, that we say really has been underdeveloped and provides a lot of opportunity for doing a much better job of managing, and also um, having more social license and just a stronger overall network um, if more emphasis is put on developing partnerships. And this is in part can be driven by improving consultation and relationship development processes. There's a lot of emphasis with Indigenous communities on FPIC, but in my experience, Indigenous communities, they're not so interested in actual FPIC agreements. They're more interested in having the principles of FPIC incorporated into the relationship and the processes that they work with. So I think that's um, that's the way to go. And as I say, it's mutually beneficial in the short term as well as in the longer term. And there's some good examples. There's a project with the Round Lake buffalo herd in Wood Buffalo National Park that has it's a multi-stakeholder group that involves Indigenous communities, forestry companies, oil and gas, mining companies, governments. There's a whole range of NGOs are involved as well. It's a very large-scale collaborative project, which is an example of the kinds of things that can happen when numbers of parties work together. So what we thought could be some next steps would be developing a work plan as to how and what to collect in terms of critical social, economic, and cultural data and indicators, and building up an information system that can be used for a variety of purposes, like including reporting, help with maintaining certification or getting certification, help just with negotiating and developing relationships with different organizations as well, being able to show them that these are the kinds of things that you're doing and these are the kinds of impacts that you're having in these spheres would be useful. Developing a framework. So this comes back to the reporting part of things. There are a number of global organizations that have developed reporting frameworks for sustainability, and this is useful for reporting to shareholders, to stakeholders, certification bodies, local and Indigenous communities. More and more organizations are doing this, and again, this is having these data would be an important component of this. We also see this as providing means for improving the relationships with NGOs and academics and other potential partners in different aspects of land and water management. And it would also be interesting to bring this into a study of cumulative effects with other non-renewable resource sectors, because we feel that there's that the forest sector is doing a lot in terms of managing the ecological component of forestry, and it's the other sectors that are less constrained than forestry is that are actually having arguably the biggest impact on biodiversity and other values that the forest has. So working with them and looking for ways to work with them and the ability that the forest sector has to help those other organizations mitigate their negative impacts could produce a very fruitful partnership.